All right, last thing we got to talk about today is we want to talk about foreign policy. So we're going to talk about the ways that the United States deals with other countries in the world. What we see here is a building we call the Pentagon. For obvious reasons, Pentagon shape. This houses the Department of Defense. So this is, a huge agency that deals with foreign policy and foreign relations in the United States. All right, foreign policy can be a lot of things. It can be diplomatic, which means these are countries like working together, negotiating. It can be military, obviously, countries like fighting each other, or it can be economic. We can be talking about trade. So it may be something like the United States defending itself from a threat. It may be something like the United States, like just pushing its own interest out there in the United States, out there in the like international arena, making sure that the United States interests are protected. And in the United States, because of the Constitution, foreign policy is only handled by the national government. This is not the kind of thing that we want 50 states dealing with on their own. So, what does the legislative branch do? This will be a little bit of a review here, but these are the powers of Congress, right? Remember, Congress declares war. They control when the country goes to war. At least they used to. Congress has the responsibility to build and maintain the Army and Navy. Only Congress controls foreign trade. Uh, Congress has to approve the diplomats. They get to like have approval over the Secretary of State and the ambassadors. And then, never forget, most important down there, Congress controls the funding for everything, and that includes funding for foreign policy projects. The executive branch, the president and the bureaucracy, they control the war making. Remember, the president, they're the commander in chief, so they decide how the military operates. The president negotiates treaties and executive agreements. So the president is the one that works with other world leaders to come to agreements here. The president picks the important diplomats, the Secretary of State, and the ambassadors. Of course, it has to be somebody that Congress agrees to. And the other thing is the president has the power to grant diplomatic recognition. So the president decides which government of a foreign country is the appropriate government that we're going to do business with. Within the executive branch, the main bodies that make foreign policy would mostly be the State Department, which like handles all the diplomacy with all the other countries, the Department of Defense, which runs the armed forces, the National Security Council we talked about, which like helps keep the president alert to all the issues going on around the world, the CIA, which is like a an intelligence gathering agency that deals with international situations, and the National Economic Council, who monitors like the global economy and finds ways for the United States to be most successful in the global economy. The State Department is the big cabinet department that deals with foreign policy. This is they do all the diplomacy, which means that they like run the embassies and all that kind of stuff in every country. They deal with like all of the relations between the United States and every other country in the world. So this is important. It was the first cabinet department. It does like all of the non-military relations, and it communicates what the United States' stance is on issues in the global community. The State Department is led by the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State is really important. This is the president's main foreign policy advisor. Of course, the president picks them, and the Senate has to agree. But they're the ones that, like, we say the president does this stuff, but actually the Secretary of State really does most of the negotiations for the president. Like they go out there and they like get the treaties agreed to and stuff, and the president comes in like at the last second whenever all the details have already been worked out. The Secretary of State deals with United States citizens all around the world. It deals with immigration policy. They're going to be the ones that like handle issues like passports and all this kind of stuff, and like ultimately like we deal with the Secretary of State if like we run into any issues while we're like traveling around the world. The Secretary of State's really important if the president, vice president, Speaker of the House, and President pro tempore were to suddenly pass away or be unable to hold office. The Secretary of State becomes president. They're the first cabinet department to step in line. The other side of foreign policy, the military side, is run by the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense got reorganized after World War II to kind of house all of the military branches here. But this is what we find in the Pentagon, which is like, brings all of the armed forces departments together so that they can coordinate policy making. This is the biggest cabinet department because it has like hundreds of thousands of employees who are like serving in the armed forces here. And like we've talked about with the budget, this takes up a huge percent of the federal budget every year. The person in charge of the Defense Department is the Secretary of Defense. They are the president's main military advisor, and they are supposed to be a civilian. That means like they are not a member of the armed forces. They may have experience, but they are supposed to be at least 7 years away from any active military duty. Congress can approve a person who has not been retired that long, and this is actually I think a dangerous trend that we haven't really used civilians since the Obama administration. So both Trump and President Biden have got this special waiver from Congress to allow very recently basically these guys retire and then take over as Secretary of Defense. So we have people that are closer to the military running the Department of Defense lately. But they have more control over the military than anybody except the President of the United States. Also, right at the top, we've got the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is the heads of the branches of the military. So the heads of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, maybe one day the Space Force. They advise the president on military policy. So they just give the president advice. They don't make the decisions, but they tell the president what they think ought to happen here. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this is the person at the top of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this is the president's main military advisor. So when the president's making foreign policy decisions, they have the the Secretary of Defense, who's supposed to be a civilian, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who is active military, and those are helping the president come to the best decision. The National Security Council is an agency we've talked about before. They coordinate these two groups. They coordinate the foreign policy and the State Department with the national defense of the Defense Department. The president decides who's on the council, but we've got the main people all the time: the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the Vice President, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, the FBI. So all these people are coming together to help advise the president about issues related to national security. This is an important group that meets with the president almost every day so that the president is always ready to defend the country from threats. And one international organization that we'll talk about is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is a military alliance created during the Cold War. This is like a multinational military force that includes the United States, Canada, most of Western Europe, expanded to Turkey and a lot of Eastern Europe after the Cold War. But this was originally formed to counter the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had its own little military alliance called the Warsaw Pact. But the idea of this is what we call collective defense. If you were to go to war with one member of NATO, you go to war with all members of NATO. So this helped protect a lot of the small countries of Europe from Soviet aggression. Soviet Union wouldn't want to go to war with a small country, because they would then have to fight with the giant military of the United States. And so this is just a multinational defense force that we still use today. All right, there's our big, strong, fearless leader, President Trump, showing off his muscles for you here. Time to take a look at our bigly ideas and see what we think about these policies. All right, so really simple to sum things up today. We want to make sure that we can describe the issues with healthcare costs and healthcare access here in the United States. We want to make sure that we can describe the ways that the government attempts to protect the environment. Some of those laws are important just because they're good examples of mandates and how they work. We want to describe the energy resources in the United States, right? Remember thinking about coal and oil and all those resources that we use to provide energy to the country. And we want to describe the people who have roles in deciding foreign policy. So pay special attention to what kind of things Congress does and what kind of things get left up to the president. And while we're speaking of presidents, there's our president, the Olympic torch carrying President Donald Trump here. So showing off as he runs across the country with the Olympic torch. All right, guys, that's it for today, and that is finally it for Unit 4. So we have taken care of all of the stuff we need to know about people's beliefs and the different ways they behave. We've talked a little bit about how liberals and conservatives disagree about all kind of issues, and we've used that to kind of go through environmental policy, healthcare policy, budget policy, economic policy, social welfare policy, millions of kinds of different policies, so that we can start to understand the ideological disagreement between these groups. So we've got one last unit and that's going to be linkage institutions. So we'll be dealing with that for the last few weeks.